November 15th, 1993. Colonel Marcus Reeves had led 73 successful missions for Delta Force. He'd never lost a man. That's exactly why someone wanted his entire unit dead in the Colombian jungle. The raid on Escobar's fortress was supposed to be routine. 8 commandos, in and out, extract the intelligence and disappear before dawn. Instead, they walked into a killing field that had been prepared for weeks. What happened in the next 4 hours became the most classified operation in U.S. military history. 3 agencies buried the files. Families were told their sons died in training accidents, and for 30 years, when anyone asked about Operation Ghost Protocol, they were transferred to different departments. The night 8 elite soldiers discovered that sometimes the enemy isn't waiting in the jungle. Sometimes the enemy gave you the mission. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first sign something was wrong came when Carlos Mendoza's radio went silent. Marcus pressed deeper into the emerald canopy, his M4 carbine tracking shadows that danced between the cecropia trees. 40 meters ahead, the limestone walls of Escobar's compound rose like ancient battlements, draped in vines and morning mist. Intelligence had called it a processing facility, 3 buildings, minimal security, skeleton crew, extract the financial records and vanish before the sun cleared the Magdalena Valley. Phantom 2, report! Marcus's whisper barely disturbed the air, static. Behind him, Sergeant Williams shifted position, his boot snapping a twig that sounded like gunfire in the pre-dawn silence. The rest of Delta Team Ghost spread through the undergrowth like lethal spores, Rodriguez covering the eastern approach. Jackson monitoring their 6, Thompson and Barrett flanking the main structure, professional, invisible, unstoppable, just like 73 times before. Marcus checked his chronometer, 347 hours. 17 minutes behind schedule because the helicopter insertion had gone sideways when their pilot spotted movement in the landing zone. They'd rappelled 2 clicks out and humped through terrain that grabbed at equipment and swallowed sound. Movement, 2 o'clock, Williams breathed. Marcus tracked right. A figure in olive fatigues emerged from the compound's rear gate, AK-47 slung casual across his shoulder. The sentry moved with the lazy confidence of a man who owned the jungle. No urgency, no awareness that 8 ghosts were studying his every step. Too easy. The thought hit Marcus like ice water. 30 seconds of observation confirmed his worst fears. The guard's weapon was pristine, no jungle rot, no tape reinforcing the stock. His boots were spotless. Even his cigarette was American-made, still crisp in its pack. This wasn't some half-trained sicario pulling night watch. This was theater. Marcus keyed his radio, voice barely a breath. All stations abort. Repeat, abort mission. Ghost leader, this is Phantom 4. Rodriguez's voice crackled with confusion. I've got eyes on the target building. Minimal security, just like briefed. Negative. Something's... The jungle exploded. Automatic weapons fire erupted from 12 different positions, muzzle flashes strobing like deadly lightning. The minimal security had been an illusion. Cartel gunmen rose from spider holes and firing positions that had been invisible moments before. Tracers carved phosphorus trails through the canopy, bark exploding from trees in deadly showers. Contact! Contact! Thompson's voice cut through the chaos. They knew we were coming. Marcus rolled behind a mahogany trunk as bullets chewed the air where his head had been. His mind processed the tactical situation with computer precision, overlapping fields of fire, prepared positions, coordinated timing. This wasn't a hasty ambush by lucky sentries. This was a carefully orchestrated kill box. Williams on me, Rodriguez, Jackson fighting withdrawal to checkpoint Alpha. But the jungle had become a maze of death. Every path they'd planned, every escape route they'd memorized, now funneled them toward waiting guns. The cartel hadn't just prepared an ambush. They'd turned the entire operational area into a hunting preserve. Marcus sprinted through the undergrowth, Williams at his shoulder, both men moving with the fluid precision of warriors who danced with death across 4 continents. Behind them, the crack of Barrett's sniper rifle answered the cartel's automatic weapons, but Marcus could hear the desperation in the spacing of shots. They were outnumbered 10-1. Ghost leader, this is Phantom 2. Carlos Mendoza's voice suddenly cut through the radio static, calm as Sunday morning. I'm in position at the primary target. Building's clear. Impossible. Marcus had watched the compound light up like a Christmas tree. No one could have penetrated that kill zone. Carlos, get out of there. Site's compromised. Negative, sir. Mission's a go. Intelligence was accurate. Something in Mendoza's tone made Marcus's blood freeze. Too calm, too certain, like a man reading from a script instead of fighting for his life. Phantom 2, what's your actual position? Silence stretched for 5 heartbeats. When Mendoza's voice returned, it carried an undertone Marcus had never heard before, something that might have been regret, or relief, or both. Sorry, Ghost, but some missions were never meant to succeed. The radio went dead. Understanding hit Marcus like a physical blow. The perfect intelligence, the flawless insertion coordinates, the detailed floor plans and guard rotations that had seemed too good to be true, because they were. Someone had fed Delta Team Ghost to the cartel like meat to sharks. Someone who knew their call signs, their procedures, their complete operational profile. Someone wearing an American uniform. Marcus keyed his radio one final time, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, unfriendly ears were listening. Let them hear. Let them know that Ghost had figured out their game. All stations, we've been sold. I say again, we've been sold. The jungle erupted in fresh gunfire, and Marcus Reeves began the longest night of his life, not knowing that 30 years later the truth would come hunting for him in a Nevada desert where ghosts were supposed to stay buried. Sometimes the dead don't rest until the living answer for their betrayal. Sorry, Ghost, but some missions were never meant to succeed. The words had haunted every dawn since 1993. Marcus rolled from his narrow bunk, bare feet finding the sun-warmed concrete floor of his trailer. Through the single window, the Mojave stretched endlessly, a canvas of rust and gold that promised nothing and demanded less. This was his sanctuary, his purgatory, his choice. The coffee maker gurgled to life with mechanical precision, a sound that had replaced the controlled chaos of mission briefings and tactical planning sessions. Marcus ran thick fingers through silver-shot hair, studying his reflection in the black screen of a television that hadn't been turned on in months. The man staring back looked older than 58 lines carved deep by desert wind and deeper regrets, shoulders still military straight but carrying invisible weight. Ghost. They'd called him Ghost even before Delta Team Ghost died screaming in a Colombian jungle. Now the name felt prophetic, a man haunting his own life. The trailer door opened without knocking, because Elena never knocked. She entered like morning itself, inevitable, gentle, bringing warmth to spaces that had grown cold in the night. Coffee steam curled between them as she crossed the small space, her bare feet silent on the concrete. "You were talking again," she said softly, fingers tracing the scars along his shoulder blade, shrapnel marks from the longest night of his life. The same words. Elena's touch could still quiet the tremors that came with certain memories. After 15 years, she remained the miracle that had emerged from Marcus's personal apocalypse, the Magdalena Valley villager he'd found half dead during his escape, carried to safety, and somehow never let go of. Her English still carried traces of her homeland, syllables that reminded him simultaneously of paradise and purgatory. Just dreams, Marcus lied, because some truths were too heavy to share with the person you'd failed to protect from them. She moved with the unconscious grace of someone comfortable in small spaces, preparing breakfast with ingredients that spoke of careful budgeting and creative resourcefulness. The trailer might be Spartan, but Elena had transformed it into something approaching home. Photographs of desert sunrises lined the narrow hallway. A small garden outside the east window grew vegetables that shouldn't survive in such harsh soil but did anyway, through her patience and stubborn hope. The private military contracts had ended 2 years ago, when Marcus finally admitted his reflexes weren't quite sharp enough anymore, his sleep too fractured to trust with other people's lives. Now he worked security for a lithium mining operation 40 miles into the empty 12-hour shifts, watching equipment and horizon through polarized sunglasses, radio chatter with supervisors who knew better than to ask about his background. It was honest work, quiet work, the kind of employment that left a man's ghosts undisturbed. "Miguel called yesterday," Elena said, sliding scrambled eggs onto a plate beside toast that was more brown than golden. Their neighbor lived in a double-wide 300 yards north, the only other permanent resident in this forgotten corner of federal land. "His generator's acting up again." Marcus nodded, already mentally cataloging the tools he'd need. Miguel was 73 and stubborn as creosote, but he'd shared his well water when Marcus first arrived and asked no questions about the haunted stranger who'd appeared one day driving a pickup truck with too many hidden compartments. These were the rhythms that had replaced tactical operations and kill-or-capture missions. Small repairs, quiet conversations, the gradual accumulation of something resembling peace. Elena worked part-time at a diner in Pahrump, serving coffee and pie to truckers and tourists who were passing through to somewhere more important. Together, they'd built a life measured in propane refills and grocery runs, sunset walks through landscape that could kill the careless, but offered profound silence to those who understood its terms. It wasn't the life Marcus had imagined at 28, leading America's elite soldiers through the world's darkest corners. But it was clean, honest, free from the weight of decisions that echoed in body counts and mission reports stamped with classifications that would outlive everyone who'd written them. Elena poured coffee into two mismatched mugs, hers chipped along the handle, his bearing the faded logo of a unit that no longer existed. She'd found it among his things years ago and rescued it from the box of items he'd intended to bury in the desert. Sometimes the smallest salvage operations proved the most important. "You're working late shift this week?" she asked, settling beside him on the narrow bench that served as their dining table. Through Thursday, Marcus tasted coffee that was stronger than necessary and exactly as Elena knew he preferred it. "Friday we'll drive to Vegas, that restaurant you wanted to try." Her smile contained enough warmth to power the trailer's electrical grid. These promises, dinner in the city, a movie, the deliberate construction of a future that extended beyond the day's immediate necessities, had become their defiance against the impermanence that military life had taught him to expect. Outside, the desert was beginning its daily transformation from cool sanctuary to furnace. Soon the temperature would climb past comfort into the realm where only the adapted survived. Marcus finished his breakfast, kissed Elena's forehead, and prepared for another 12 hours of watching emptiness for threats that probably weren't coming. He had no way of knowing that this particular morning the threats were already en route. In 30 years of watching his six, he'd learned to read the desert's vocabulary of disturbance. Coyotes moved low and quick, barely stirring the hardpan. Wind devils announced themselves with theatrical spirals that dissipated as suddenly as they formed. Locals drove with the unhurried confidence of people who understood that the Mojave didn't reward haste. This dust cloud rose straight and purposeful, thrown by a vehicle moving too fast for the terrain and closing the distance with mathematical precision. Marcus pulled over beneath the skeletal shade of a Joshua tree and killed the engine. The approaching vehicle materialized through the heat, shimmer a black SUV with government plates and enough radio antennas to communicate with satellites. It stopped 20 feet away, engine ticking in the sudden silence. The woman who emerged wore a charcoal suit that belonged in Washington boardrooms, not Nevada wasteland. Early 30s, athletic build, sunglasses that reflected Marcus's own weathered face back at him. She moved with the controlled precision that marked federal law enforcement alert without appearing threatening, professional without being cold. Colonel Marcus Reeves? The rank hit him like a physical blow. Nobody had called him colonel in 15 years. That man had died in a Colombian jungle, replaced by the ghost who fixed generators and watched empty horizons. Just Marcus now. His voice carried the rust of disuse and old caution. "You're a long way from anywhere official. Special Agent Sarah Chen, DEA." She produced credentials that looked genuine, but Marcus had seen enough forgeries to know that appearance meant little. "I need to speak with you about Operation Ghost Thunder." The classified designation made Marcus's hands go cold despite the climbing temperature. Operation Ghost Thunder had been buried under so many layers of classification that even the men who died executing it weren't supposed to exist. For 30 years, that had been the deal: silence in exchange for survival, a pension, and the promise that certain truths would stay buried with the men who'd carried them. "I think you've got the wrong person," Marcus said carefully. "I've been mining security for your Delta Force unit was betrayed to Pablo Escobar's cartel on September 23, 1993. Chen's words fell like hammer blows. 7 men went into the Magdalena Valley. 1 came out, you. Marcus studied her face, reading micro-expressions the way he'd once read foreign terrain. Determination, yes. Preparation, certainly. But underneath the professional composure, something else flickered. Urgency that went beyond career advancement or bureaucratic box-checking. "That operation is classified above your clearance level," Marcus said. "Whatever you think you know, I know Carlos Mendoza didn't die in that jungle." The world tilted sideways. Marcus felt the desert floor shift beneath his boots, reality reorganizing itself around 6 words that shouldn't exist. Carlos Mendoza had been dead for 30 years. Marcus had written the after-action report himself, listing his friend among the Kia when no bodies could be recovered from the cartel's killing ground. Agent Chen reached into her jacket with movements slow enough to avoid triggering reflexes that had kept Marcus alive through wars on 3 continents. She withdrew a manila envelope thick with photographs and documents. "These were declassified last month," she said, "part of a congressional investigation into cartel penetration of U.S. intelligence networks." The first photograph stopped Marcus's breath. Carlos Mendoza stood beside a swimming pool that could have belonged to any wealthy Colombian estate. But this wasn't 1993. The timestamp read July 15, 2019, 5 years ago. Carlos looked older silver, threading through his black hair, lines marking his face but unmistakably alive, unmistakably himself. Standing beside him was a man Marcus recognized from old intelligence files, Roberto Vasquez, Escobar's financial lieutenant, the man responsible for laundering billions of dollars through American banks. "There are 17 more photographs spanning a 12-year period," Chen said quietly. "Your teammate didn't just survive that ambush, Colonel. He orchestrated it." Marcus's hands trembled as he flipped through the images. Carlos at cartel meetings. Carlos shaking hands with men who'd placed bounties on American soldiers. Carlos wearing expensive suits and watches that cost more than military salaries allowed. The man who'd whispered Zari, ghost. But some missions were never meant to succeed hadn't been apologizing. He'd been explaining. "Why now?" Marcus's voice sounded foreign to his own ears. "Why bring this to me after 30 years? Chen removed her sunglasses, revealing eyes that held the weight of someone who'd seen too much too young. "Because 3 weeks ago, someone put a bullet in Carlos Mendoza's head, and before he died he gave up names, American names, people who've been helping cartels target U.S. operations for 3 decades. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Your name was on that list, Colonel." "Not as a target." Marcus stared at the photographs until they blurred, understanding crystallizing like ice in his veins. The careful life he'd built, the sanctuary in the desert, Elena, who'd appeared in his path like a miracle when he'd needed salvation most. "As an asset," Chen finished. "No." The word came out strangled, barely human. "That's impossible. I was there. I carried my men's dog tags out of that jungle." Agent Chen crouched beside him, her voice gentler now but no less relentless. "The intelligence that sent your unit into that compound, where did it come from?" Marcus's mind reeled backward, grasping for details that had calcified into gospel over 3 decades. CIA asset, Escobar's inner circle, gold-plated source. What was the source's code name? The question hit like a sniper's bullet, precise, devastating, from an angle he hadn't seen coming, because suddenly Marcus couldn't remember. 30 years of nightmares about that mission, and he'd never questioned the origin of the intelligence that killed his men. "I need you to leave," Marcus said, scrambling to collect the photographs. His hands shook like an old man's, betraying him. "This conversation is over." Chen didn't move. "Colonel, someone is cleaning house. 3 weeks ago, Carlos Mendoza. Last week, a retired CIA analyst named Morrison car accident in Arlington. 4 days ago, a Pentagon liaison officer named Patterson apparent suicide in his Bethesda home. Each name landed like artillery, systematic destruction of Marcus's ability to deny what was happening. These weren't random deaths. This was a methodical elimination of loose ends, and he was sitting exposed in the middle of nowhere with a DEA agent who just painted targets on both their backs. "You need to get out of here," Marcus said urgently, standing so fast his vision grayed. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into." "I know enough." Chen's calm was infuriating, professional. "I know you're next on someone's list. I know you've been living under surveillance for years without realizing it. And I know the only way you survive is by helping me understand what really happened in Colombia." Marcus was already moving toward his truck, military instinct screaming warnings that had kept him breathing through decades of close calls. The desert suddenly felt like a kill zone, too open, too exposed, with sight lines that extended for miles in every direction. "Colonel." Chen's voice carried absolute certainty. "Elena Vasquez isn't who you think she is." Marcus froze, his hand on the truck's door handle. The world contracted to a single point of impossible sound. Elena's last name spoken by a stranger in the middle of nowhere. "What did you say?" "Elena Vasquez. Born Magdalena Valley, Colombia, 1975. Daughter of Miguel Vasquez, Roberto Vasquez's younger brother." Chen's words fell like stones into still water, each one creating expanding circles of destruction. "She didn't stumble into your path during your escape, Colonel. She was positioned there." The desert spun around Marcus like a centrifuge, 30 years of memories reorganizing themselves into a pattern too hideous to accept. Elena finding him half dead from blood loss and dehydration. Elena nursing him back to health in a village that should have been controlled by cartel gunmen. Elena's miraculous appearance at the exact moment when Marcus had been too broken to question Providence. "You're lying." Chen produced another photograph. Elena, but not as Marcus had ever seen her. Younger, maybe 19, standing beside a man who could have been her father. The timestamp read September 1993, the same month Delta Team Ghost had died screaming in the jungle. The man beside her was Roberto Vasquez. "She's been reporting on you for 30 years, Chen continued relentlessly. "Every move, every habit, every person you've come into contact with. You weren't hiding in the desert, Colonel, you were quarantined there." Marcus's legs gave out. He sat heavily on the truck's running board, staring at the photograph until the images blurred together. Elena's laugh from this morning, her gentle touch on his scars, the careful way she'd built their life together, asking so few questions about his past, encouraging his isolation, supporting his desire to stay invisible. Elena, who had never once suggested they travel beyond the desert's borders. Elena, who had discouraged him from maintaining contact with any surviving military personnel. Elena, who somehow always knew when to be absent during his rare visits from old comrades, visits that had grown increasingly infrequent over the years until they stopped entirely. "The mining job," Marcus said slowly. "The security position, did she? The company's owned by a shell corporation with ties to Colombian interests." Chen's voice carried genuine sympathy now. "You were never free, Colonel. You've been in the world's most comfortable prison cell." A new sound reached them across the desert engines, multiple vehicles approaching fast from 3 directions. Chen was already moving, her hand inside her jacket, scanning the horizon with the alertness of someone who'd expected this possibility. "We need to move, now." But Marcus couldn't move. Couldn't think beyond the expanding realization that every sunrise for 30 years had been a lie, every gentle touch a manipulation, every moment of peace a carefully constructed illusion designed to keep him docile and monitored. The engines grew closer, and Marcus understood with crystal clarity that his sanctuary had just become his tomb. "Move!" Chen grabbed his shoulder, but Marcus remained frozen on the truck's running board, staring at the photograph of Elena and Roberto Vasquez. The implications kept expanding like ripples from a stone dropped in black water. If Elena had been watching him for 30 years, reporting on him, then she knew about every nightmare, every moment of guilt, every time he'd whispered apologies to his dead brothers in his sleep. She knew about the lockbox buried beneath their trailer's floor. "The files," Marcus breathed. "Jesus Christ, she knows about the files." "What files?" Chen's voice carried sharp urgency as the engine sounds grew louder. "Colonel, what files?" Marcus forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady beneath him. "Mission recordings, radio transcripts, Carlos's last transmission before—" He couldn't finish, before Carlos had sold them all to die. "She doesn't just know they exist," he continued, nausea building in his throat. "She knows where they are. She's known for 30 years. The first vehicle crested a distant ridge-black SUV identical to Chen's, but moving with predatory speed that spoke of hostile intent. Chen was scanning the terrain with professional assessment, calculating angles and distances with the focused calm of someone accustomed to sudden violence. "Your truck or mine?" she asked. But Marcus was already moving, not toward either vehicle but toward the scattered photographs Chen had dropped. His hands shook as he gathered them up. 30 years of constructed reality crumbling with each image of Elena's deception, the careful way she'd built their life, the gentle questions about his dreams, the concerned touches when he woke screaming. She'd been cataloging his trauma for her handlers. "Leave them," Chen commanded. "We need to—" "No," Marcus's voice carried iron forged in Colombian jungles. "These men died because of her, because of me trusting her. I won't leave them scattered in the dirt again." The second vehicle appeared from the northeast, close enough now that Marcus could see weapons mounted on the roof, professional hardware, military grade. Whatever protection his 30 years of silence had bought him had just expired with extreme prejudice. Chen was right, they needed to run. But as Marcus climbed behind the wheel of his pickup, a different kind of understanding crystallized. Elena would be waiting at the trailer, probably with Miguel's generator repair as an alibi for why she couldn't accompany him to work today. She'd want to know about his unexpected visitor, about why he'd returned home hours early. She'd been perfecting that concerned expression for 3 decades. "Follow me," he told Chen through his open window, "but stay back if this goes bad." "Where are you going?" Chen's composure finally cracked. "The trailer is compromised. She'll have backup waiting." "She'll have answers," Marcus corrected grimly, firing the ignition, "and 30 years of my life to account for." The truck's engine roared to life, drowning out Chen's protests. In his rearview mirror, the pursuing vehicles had spread into a classic hunting formation, designed to prevent escape across the open desert. They knew his roots, his preferences, his habits. Of course they did. Elena had been filing reports. Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel as another realization hit him like shrapnel. The rare visits from old comrades that had grown increasingly infrequent over the years. What if they hadn't stopped coming by choice? What if Elena's careful absences during those visits hadn't been coincidence but opportunity? Miguel's generator problems. The convenient emergencies that always seemed to require Elena's attention whenever Marcus had company. The way his former teammates had gradually lost touch one by one until he'd convinced himself it was natural drift, the inevitable dissolution of bonds forged in violence. What if it hadn't been natural at all? Patterson, Morrison, Carlos, he whispered, each name a nail in his coffin of understanding. The men who'd died in the past month hadn't been random targets. They'd been everyone who could have told Marcus the truth about his own life. Everyone except Elena. The trailer appeared ahead, unchanged and innocent in the desert heat. Elena's small garden still grew impossibly green against the harsh landscape. The wind chimes still sang their gentle music in the breeze. Everything looked exactly as it had when Marcus left for work this morning, carrying Elena's kiss and promises of Friday dinner in Las Vegas. But now he understood what he was really looking at, a crime scene that had been active for 30 years. Chen's SUV pulled up beside him as he parked, her expression grim with professional recognition. "Colonel, this is tactically insane. She's had hours to prepare." Marcus stared at the trailer where he'd built his life on lies. "She's had 30 years to prepare, Agent Chen, but she's never seen me angry." He climbed out of the truck, photographs clutched in his fist, and walked toward the woman who'd been slowly murdering him with kindness since 1993. "You're home early," Elena said, her voice carrying that familiar note of gentle concern. "Is everything all right?" Marcus held up the photographs, watching her expression with the tactical focus he'd once reserved for reading enemy positions. For just an instant less than a heartbeat, something shifted behind Elena's dark eyes. Not surprise, recognition. "We need to talk," Marcus said. Elena's gaze flicked to Chen, then back to the photographs and Marcus's trembling hand. When she smiled this time, it was different. Smaller, more honest than anything she'd shown him in 3 decades. "I suppose we do." She stepped aside, gesturing them into the trailer. "Please, come in, both of you." The interior looked exactly as Marcus had left it that morning, but now every detail screamed deception. The strategic placement of mirrors that provided sightlines to all windows. The emergency radio disguised as a weather scanner. The way Elena had arranged their furniture to create clear fields of fire while appearing perfectly domestic. Marcus had built this life believing he was protecting Elena from his dangerous past. Instead, she'd been protecting her operation from discovery. 30 years, Marcus said quietly, dropping the photographs on their kitchen table. The images scattered across the surface where they'd shared countless meals, countless quiet conversations about nothing that mattered. 30 years of lies. Elena moved to the window, her posture relaxed but her positioning tactical. She could see Chen's SUV from there, could track any approaching vehicles. Professional habits died hard even when the operation was blown. "Not lies," Elena said softly. "Not all of it." "Carlos is alive," Marcus's voice cracked. "My men died thinking they were on a rescue mission and you helped murder them. Your men died because war is ugly and someone always pays the price." Elena's mask was sliding away completely now, revealing something harder underneath. "You think you were innocent in that jungle? You think your government's hands were clean?" Chen stepped closer to the table, her own weapon visible beneath her jacket. "Tell him about the asset, Elena. Tell him about the intelligence that sent his unit into that compound." Elena laughed, a sound Marcus had never heard before, sharp and bitter as broken glass. "The asset? The asset was sitting in a CIA conference room in Langley, not Escobar's inner circle. Your precious mission was designed to fail from the beginning." The trailer wall seemed to contract around Marcus. "What are you talking about?" "Operation Ghost Thunder was a liability cleanup," Elena continued, her accent subtly shifting, becoming more pronounced. 7 men who'd stumbled onto evidence of American intelligence agencies working with cartels. 7 men who'd started asking uncomfortable questions about money flows and weapon shipments. Marcus sank into a kitchen chair, the same chair where he'd eaten breakfast with her 12 hours ago. "That's impossible. We were tracking Escobar's financial networks. We were going after Roberto Vasquez." "You were going after him," Elena agreed. "But not to capture him, to silence him." Roberto had started talking about his American partners, about the agencies that helped launder cartel money through U.S. banks. Your mission was never about gathering intelligence. She moved closer, her voice dropping to the intimate tone she'd used for 3 decades of bedtime conversations. It was about ensuring certain secrets died in that jungle. Then why did I survive? Marcus whispered. Elena's expression softened for just a moment, revealing something that might have been genuine emotion. Because Carlos convinced them you could be useful. Broken, isolated, controllable. A living symbol of American sacrifice that would never question why he'd been allowed to escape when better men died. The words hit Marcus like rifle rounds, each one finding its mark with devastating precision. He thought of every flag ceremony he'd attended, every veteran he'd met who'd thanked him for his service, every moment he'd carried survivor's guilt like a badge of honor. They'd needed him alive to sell the lie. And you? Marcus looked at the woman he'd shared his bed with, his nightmares, his broken heart. What were you? Elena reached into a kitchen drawer slowly, carefully, with movements designed not to trigger Chen's reflexes. She withdrew a satellite phone, military grade, definitely not standard equipment for a mining contractor's wife. I was your handler, she said simply, but somewhere along the way, I made the mistake of believing my own cover story. She speed-dialed a number, her eyes never leaving Marcus's face. When she spoke, it was rapid Spanish, directed at whoever answered. Marcus caught enough words to understand she was reporting a blown operation, requesting immediate extraction. Chen's weapon was halfway out of its holster when Elena cut the connection. 30 years of monitoring you, Elena said, her voice carrying something that might have been regret. 30 years of reports about your nightmares, your isolation, your pathetic attempts to build meaning from meaningless survival. Her mask slipped completely then, revealing the operator underneath, cold, professional, utterly without mercy. You want to know the truth, Marcus? You were never a ghost. You were just a very well-trained dog who'd forgotten he was on a leash. You made a mistake, Marcus said quietly. Elena's eyebrows lifted slightly. Did I? You assumed I was broken. Marcus stepped closer, watching her professional composure crack by degrees. You assumed 30 years of guilt and isolation had made me weak, controllable. Chen shifted position, reading the change in atmosphere with predator instincts. The trailer suddenly felt smaller, charged with the kind of energy that preceded violence. You reported on my nightmares, Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength. Every scream, every cold sweat, every moment I woke up calling for my dead brothers. But you missed something important in all those reports, didn't you? Elena's hand moved closer to the kitchen drawer she'd closed. Marcus, the nightmares weren't about guilt. His voice carried the authority of a man who just remembered what he was capable of. They were about rage, pure, focused, 30-year-old rage that I'd been carrying like a loaded weapon. The satellite phone buzzed with an incoming call. Elena glanced at it, then back at Marcus, and for the first time since the photographs had scattered across their table, she looked uncertain. You want to know what your handlers never understood? Marcus asked. What Carlos never told them when he sold my team for whatever pieces of silver made him rich. Elena didn't answer the phone. I wasn't the youngest member of Delta Team Ghost. I wasn't the least experienced. I was the most dangerous. Marcus's smile held no warmth whatsoever. They kept me alive because Carlos convinced them I was harmless. But Carlos was always a terrible judge of character. Chen's weapon was fully drawn now, trained not on Elena but toward the windows. She'd spotted something outside that made her curse under her breath. Company's coming, she announced. Multiple vehicles approaching from all directions. Elena finally answered the satellite phone, speaking rapid Spanish that sounded increasingly desperate. Whoever was on the other end was giving her instructions that made her face go pale. They're not coming to extract you, are they? Marcus observed. They're coming to clean up the mess, all of it, including you. You don't understand, Elena said, cutting the connection. There are protocols, procedures for blown operations. I understand perfectly. Marcus moved to the window, scanning the desert landscape with eyes that hadn't lost their tactical edge. The same protocols that got my team killed, the same procedures that have been keeping me on ice for 30 years. 3 black SUVs were visible now, closing in with military precision. But Marcus wasn't looking at them with the desperate fear of a hunted man. He was assessing them with the cold calculation of someone who'd spent decades planning for this exact moment. Elena, Marcus said conversationally, do you remember the story I told you about my first week in the desert, about why I chose this particular piece of nowhere to build our life? Elena's professional mask was completely gone now, replaced by something approaching panic. Marcus, we need to leave now. They have orders to eliminate all witnesses. I told you it was because of the isolation, the peace and quiet. Marcus opened a cabinet that Elena had assumed contained dishes for 30 years. Instead, he withdrew a modified assault rifle that had been carefully maintained and ready for use. But that was only part of the truth. Chen's eyes widened as Marcus began retrieving additional weapons from hidden locations throughout the trailer. Each movement was practiced, efficient, speaking to years of preparation. "I chose this location because it's a natural kill zone," Marcus continued, checking his rifle's action with muscle memory that 30 years hadn't eroded. 3 approaches, all of them exposed, high ground advantage, clear sight lines for 2 miles in every direction. Elena stared at him as if seeing a stranger. "You've been planning this every day for 30 years. Marcus's voice carried the satisfaction of a man whose patience had finally been rewarded. "Every morning when I kissed you goodbye. Every night when I listened to you breathe beside me, knowing what you were. Every moment of this beautiful life we built on lies." The satellite phone buzzed again. This time, Elena didn't answer. "You want to know the real truth?" Marcus asked, taking position at a window that provided optimal fields of fire. "I've known what you were since year 5. The careful questions, the convenient absences, the way you discouraged any contact with my past." Elena's face went white. "That's impossible." "I was Delta Force, Elena. We were trained to recognize infiltration, manipulation, long-term surveillance operations." Marcus smiled, and this time it held genuine warmth, not for her, but for his long-dead brothers who were finally going to be avenged. "I let you think you were handling me because I needed you to lead me to the people responsible, and now, after 30 years of patience, they're coming to me." The first SUV crested the ridge, close enough now to see weapon-mounted positions. Marcus chambered around and settled into firing position. "Game's over, Elena." 30 years, she whispered. "Whatever you think you know, I know Carlos didn't die in that jungle." Marcus's scope found the lead vehicle's driver, a clean shot at 400 yards. "I know he's been running black operations for whoever pays the highest price, and I know you've been filing reports that kept me isolated and harmless while he cleaned up loose ends." Chen's radio crackled with intercepted chatter, tactical commands in professional English, not the Spanish they might have expected from cartel operators, government frequencies, military protocols. "CIA?" Chen asked grimly. "Or contractors working for them," Marcus replied. "The alphabet soup doesn't matter anymore. They're all here for the same reason." Elena's mask slipped one final time, revealing something that might have been genuine anguish. "The feelings weren't fake, Marcus. The life we built, some of it was real." Marcus's crosshairs settled on the lead SUV's windshield. "I know, that's what made this so perfect. You had to believe your own cover story to sell it to me. But believing it also made you sloppy." The convoy was within optimal range now, close enough that Marcus could see tactical gear through tinted windows. Professional operators carrying serious hardware, but they were approaching a target they believed to be cornered and desperate. They had no idea they were entering a trap 30 years in the making. "The emergency radio you think I never noticed," Marcus said conversationally. "The mirrors positioned for tactical advantage, the way you always knew when vehicles were approaching before I did. You've been running counter-surveillance on our own home, Elena, watching the watchers." Elena's breathing became shallow, rapid. "They'll kill us all. You, me, Agent Chen, everyone who knows." "They'll try." Marcus's voice carried the cold certainty of someone who'd already accepted every possible outcome. "But they're making the same mistake Carlos made in that Colombian jungle. They're underestimating their target." The lead SUV stopped 300 yards out, close enough for a killing shot, but far enough to deploy teams safely. Marcus watched through his scope as doors opened and tactical figures emerged, moving with professional precision toward what they believed was a routine cleanup operation. "Agent Chen," Marcus said without taking his eye from the scope, "when this starts, stay low and watch the rear approach. They'll try to flank us through the generator shed." Chen nodded, her composure steady despite facing odds that should have terrified her. "What about Elena?" Marcus finally looked at the woman who'd shared his bed, his secrets, and his carefully managed breakdown for 3 decades. She stood frozen by the kitchen sink, clutching the satellite phone like a lifeline, understanding at last that she'd been playing a game where she was never more than a disposable piece. "Elena's going to call them off," Marcus said with absolute certainty. "Because she's finally realized that the man they sent her to monitor never existed. She's been filing reports on a ghost." He turned back to his rifle, settling into the shooting position he'd practiced countless times in this exact spot. "And ghosts," Marcus said, "are very hard to kill." Marcus's rifle spoke with the authority of 30 years' worth of suppressed rage, and the lead SUV's driver slumped forward onto his horn, the The sustained blare echoed across the Nevada wasteland as tactical teams scrambled for cover behind armored vehicles that suddenly felt inadequate. Elena grabbed the satellite phone with trembling fingers, screaming Spanish into the receiver orders to abort, to fall back, to recognize they'd walked into a kill zone. But the static that answered her told Marcus everything he needed to know about how disposable she'd always been. "They cut your frequency," he said, already tracking his next target. "Just like they cut Carlos's team after the jungle. No loose ends, remember?" The second shot took out a tactical leader coordinating the flanking maneuver Agent Chen had predicted. Professional soldiers dove for cover behind rocks and scrub brush, their certainty evaporating like desert mist as they realized their intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. Chen's service weapon added its voice to the firefight, covering the rear approach with precise shots that spoke to federal training. But it was Marcus who controlled the battlefield, his rifle finding targets with mechanical efficiency that turned a cleanup operation into a slaughter. 30 years, he said between shots, his voice carrying across the trailer like a eulogy. 30 years of reports about a broken man who jumped at shadows and drank too much, and couldn't sleep without medication. Elena pressed herself against the kitchen cabinets, watching her handler become something she'd never seen before. Not the grief-stricken survivor she'd monitored, but the operator who'd been deemed too dangerous to live. The tactical teams were retreating now, dragging their wounded back to vehicles that offered protection but no escape. Marcus had chosen his ground too well. Every route in was exposed, and every route out led through his crosshairs. "Did you love me?" Elena asked, her voice barely audible above the gunfire. Marcus paused, his finger easing off the trigger as the immediate threat fell back to regroup. Through his scope, he could see them calling for backup, for air support, for anything that might salvage a mission gone catastrophically wrong. "Yes," he said finally. "That's the tragedy of it all. I loved you completely, even knowing what you were. I loved the woman you became while pretending to be my wife." Elena's sob echoed in the trailer like a death rattle. "Then why?" "Because loving you didn't bring back Collins, Morrison, or Patterson." Marcus's crosshairs found another target. "Because 30 years of happiness built on lies doesn't balance the scales." Agent Chen's radio crackled with intercepted chatter-desperate requests for extraction, for tactical support, for someone to explain how a routine termination had become a massacre. Through it all, Marcus continued his methodical work, each shot precise, purposeful, final. The sun was setting when the last SUV retreated beyond effective range, carrying survivors who would spend the rest of their lives explaining how one man had destroyed an entire operation. Elena sat on the kitchen floor, no longer crying, her satellite phone silent beside her like a dead thing. "They'll send more," she said. Marcus set down his rifle and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the desert that had been his home and his fortress for 30 years. Blood stained the sand where professional killers had learned the difference between a target and a predator. "Let them come," he said. "I have time." Chen holstered her weapon and moved toward the table where declassified photographs still lay scattered, the evidence that had started this day's reckoning. "What now, Colonel?" Marcus picked up a photograph of Carlos Mendoza standing beside Pablo Escobar's inner circle, studying the face of the man who'd sold 7 soldiers for 30 years of comfortable retirement. His brother, his betrayer, his final target. "Now, we finish what they started in that Colombian jungle." Marcus's smile held the warmth of a man who'd finally found his purpose. They wanted to create a ghost. Tonight they're going to meet one. Outside, the desert wind began to blow, carrying away the gunpowder smoke and the blood and the echoes of justice 30 years delayed. But it couldn't carry away the satisfaction in Marcus Reeves's eyes as he planned his next move in a game that was finally nearing its end. Elena watched him from the kitchen floor, seeing clearly for the first time the man she'd been sent to monitor. Not broken, not controllable, not harmless, just very, very patient. And now, finally, free.